All right, so today we're going to be talking about the English Civil War. So as you can see there, this conflict, which is a very long conflict, lasts from 1603 to 1688. So there's a lot of different stages. It's very complicated. There's a lot of competing groups and competing motives. So I'm going to do my best to help break this down for you. All right. So actually, quite a lot like the wars of religion. You thought those were over with. Not quite. There's sort of a political and a religious dimension to this conflict. So we're going to look at both as we go throughout this. So first of all, in terms of the political conflict, there's a struggle between the king and parliament. And parliament, right, is England's legislature, so it makes laws, and it's made up of nobles as well as wealthy non-noble landowners. So have we seen this conflict between nobles and the king before? Yes, we have, right? So there's kind of that going on in England. But there's also a religious aspect to this conflict as well. So we've got three competing groups in England, as we'll see. We've got Catholics, they're still there, and then we've got two groups of Protestants, which we'll talk about in just a second. You can probably imagine who they are. Now, just to give you the end of this conflict before we even go into it, Parliament's going to win. And what they're going to do is England's still going to have a monarchy, but Parliament is going to put limits on the power of the monarch. And this is going to make England into what we call a limited or constitutional monarchy, which is a country in which the monarch is not all powerful, so it's not an absolute monarchy. And in this kind of government, the king or the monarch is bound by the law. So just like any other ordinary person, they've got to obey the law. They've got to listen to Parliament too. Now, England is actually still a constitutional monarchy, so they've still got a monarch, but Parliament is dominant. So this system is going to stick, really, after a really, really, really long conflict to get there. All right. So look, we're going to talk about the context before we get into this. So let's talk a little bit about the political context first, and then let's talk about the religious context. So in terms of the political context, let's talk about Parliament. So Parliament is kind of like our Congress. So it's a legislature, right? And it's made up of an upper and a lower house. So two houses there. So rather than having the Senate and the House like we have, they've got the House of Lords and the House of Commons. So the House of Lords is made up of the nobility and it's not elected. The House of Commons, in contrast, are the lower house. These are representatives elected from local areas. So this chamber is dominated by this class called the gentry, who are wealthy but non-noble landowners, so they don't have titles. So there's a long history of struggle between Parliament and the King, and we've already seen a little bit about this before, right? So first of all, there's the Magna Carta, which you might have learned about in middle school. And this is this document where the nobles theoretically put the king under the control of the law. So they said the king has to follow the law just like anybody else. Now, the king didn't really pay attention to this, but it was really important symbolically because the nobles could always say, hey, we have this history of having these agreements with the king. Like, we used to be in charge and we want to be in charge again, right? Now, not only that, but remember, when we talked about in Unit 1, we talked about the rise of the new monarchs, and we said that one of the things that the new monarchs did is they tried to put limits on the power of the nobility. Yeah, one of the ones that we talked about was Henry VII, and we mentioned that he tried to control the nobility through this sort of extrajudicial judicial court system called the Court of the Star Chamber. So that's still in place, so there's still tension here over that kind of thing. All right, now let's talk about the religious context. So as I mentioned, right, there's three competing religious groups in England. So first of all, we've got the Anglicans, right? We know that was founded by Henry VIII because he wanted to get a divorce. And we know that because it was founded for this really political reason, right, it resembles the Catholic Church in a lot of ways, right? And one of the ways that's going to become really controversial during this lesson is the organization of the Anglican Church. So the Anglican Church follows what we call an episcopal model, or sort of like this top-down model of leadership. So it's got this hierarchy of bishops who serve the king, who is the head of the church. So the king has a lot of control over the church, right? And they do it through this episcopal model. Now, if it helps you guys to remember what this model is called and what it is, just FYI, the Anglican Church in the United States is also called the Episcopalian Church. So if that helps you remember that word episcopal there. So we've got the Anglicans, and then we've also got another group of Protestants here, and these are the Calvinists. Now, the English Calvinists call themselves the Puritans, and they don't like the Anglicans very much because they think the Anglican Church is too close to Catholicism. They really don't like that episcopal model, as we will see. Now, in addition to them, there's also the Catholics, right, who dislike all of these various Protestant groups, as they are wont to do, right? Now, as we remember from last unit, Queen Elizabeth I was a really skilled politician, and she was able to manage the interests of all these competing groups. But as soon as she dies, tensions are going to start to build again. All right. So before we get into that, let's look at our cast of characters because there's quite a few. And I'll have their picture up in the corner of the screen as we go through this, so you can tell who's in charge at what moment. So we're gonna go King James the First, King Charles the First. We're gonna take a little break from kings, and we're gonna have Oliver Cromwell, who, as we will find out, is a dictator. And then we're gonna go back to kings. We're gonna have King Charles II, King James II. I put them together because they're really not that different. And then we're gonna end up with King William and Queen Mary. All right, so let's start with King James I. Now, he is the successor to Queen Elizabeth. He's a relative, and he actually starts out as King of Scotland, and then he's going to become King of England and have control over both crowns. He is not as good at ruling as Queen Elizabeth I. So he faces all kinds of both political and religious opposition, really from all sides. So in terms of political opposition, he does not get along with Parliament, and this is because he believes in the divine right of kings, and he does not like having to share power with anybody. Parliament, as you can imagine, does not respond well to this. But King Charles also faces religious conflict, right? So King James is Anglican, so he's part of the Church of England. So as you can imagine, the Puritans do not like him very much. So what they really don't like, again, is that whole Episcopalian model, right? So King James really likes this model because he knows that if there's sort of like this hierarchy of bishops who is loyal to him, right, that gives him a lot of power, and we know that he likes power, right? And meanwhile, on the other hand, the Puritans are like, no, that just looks too much like the Catholic Church. This makes us nervous. We do not like this. Now, King James is not beloved by the Catholics either. And in fact, they attempt to assassinate him. So there's this guy named Guy Fawkes. He organized this thing called the Gunpowder Plot, in which he tries to assassinate King James I, as well as some other members of his government. It fails, but it really spooks King James a lot. All right, so after King James I, we can see tension starting to build here, right? It's going to get worse under his son, King Charles I. So King Charles I, like his dad, does not like having to share power with Parliament at all. He wants to be like an absolute monarch. He is not satisfied with having to share power with Parliament. So Parliament knows this too. They don't like him. And so in an attempt to take some power back from the monarchy, they pass something called the Petition of Right. And what this does is it forbids the king from collecting new taxes without Parliament's agreement, right? So like, hey, king, if you want to collect money, you can't be like Louis XIV. You can't just go out and grab it for yourself. You got to talk to us first, right? Charles I does not like this. He decides to respond to this by kind of acting like a 12-year-old, and he just refuses to let Parliament meet at all, right? So imagine, like, this would be like the equivalent in the United States if Donald Trump decided that he didn't want to work with Congress, and he just, like, refused to let Congress meet at all, right? He's like, I'm doing it by myself, goodbye, right? Parliament, as you can imagine, not happy about this. Now, not only that, but Charles I also completely ignores the Petition of Right, and he's like, I'm gonna collect whatever darn taxes I please, and he starts levying these things called ship money, which are taxes, and Parliament is not happy about this at all. Charles I also has some religious problems, so he's technically Anglican, but he marries a Catholic, and he tries to bring some of that Catholic ritual back into the Anglican Church. And then not only that, so he's obviously bugging pretty much every Anglican, or not every, a lot of Anglicans as well as Calvinists there a lot. Not only that, but then he decides that he's going to impose the Anglican Book of Prayer onto the Scots, who are Calvinist, who revolt. And this is what forces Charles I's hand, and he's like, oh shoot, I can't collect all this money to fight this war on myself. I need to go ask Parliament for help. So he does. So he finally, after not letting Parliament meet for a really long time, he brings them back, and he says, guys, I need help. And this session of Parliament is called the Long Parliament because it lasts for 20 years, which is pretty impressive for Charles I. He likes to disband them, as we know. But this does not solve any of the conflicts. So, the Long Parliament, now that they are back in power, they are not happy about having been disbanded. So they decide to attempt to put more limits on the power of the king. So what they do is they pass this thing called the Triennial Act, so 3 years. And what that does is it requires the monarch to call Parliament regularly, right? So he can't just disband them and not let them come back whenever he wants. It's not good. They also overturn some of those taxes that Charles I tried to levy. Charles I, predictably, not happy, again behaves like a 12-year-old. And what he does is he actually tries to arrest a bunch of members of Parliament, and this is what leads to civil war. All right, stage 4, civil war. So the Civil War in England, as you can probably imagine by now, is between backers of Charles I, whom we call the Royalists, as well as the Parliamentarians, who you'll sometimes also see the Roundheads because haircuts. And the Parliamentarians, what they decide to do is they're facing a king with an army. So they're like, why don't we just form our own army? So Parliament forms an army, and this is called the New Model Army, and they appoint this guy named Oliver Cromwell up in the corner, who looks to me kind of like Jeremy Irons. I think he'd play him in a movie. Oliver Cromwell gets put in charge. Oliver Cromwell, radical Puritan, so he's one of those hardcore Calvinists, right? So you can kind of see where this is going to go. So what the parliamentarians do is they actually win. So they capture Charles I, but they aren't really sure what to do with him. So we've got some parliamentarians are like, hey, king messed up, but why don't we do this? We'll put him back on the throne, but we'll make it really clear to him that, like, we're in charge, we Parliament are in charge, we'll put limits on his power. And then you've got the Puritans in Parliament who are, again, not happy with the king at all because of religious reasons, right? They're like, no, we gave him enough chances, we want him dead. So Cromwell actually is ultimately going to seize control of Parliament. What he's going to do is he's going to purge Parliament of the moderates. He's like, I want the king dead. I don't want anyone who disagrees with me in Parliament. And he creates this much smaller and more radical rump Parliament. And he wins, and he beheads Charles I. So that's the end of him. All right. Now, again, as I mentioned kind of at the top, England is going to take a detour from monarchy for a little while. And we're going to get Cromwell in charge. So initially, Cromwell, interestingly enough, actually tries to rule, as you could imagine, a country ruled by a legislature. He tries to make England a republic, kind of like the Dutch Republic or kind of like the United States. But this doesn't last very long. And that's because he's just preoccupied with all these people trying to fight him, essentially. So we've got Catholics who don't like him because he's a Puritan, right? And especially Irish Catholics. So over in Ireland, which is majority Catholic, they want both religious freedom and national independence, so they revolt. We've got supporters of Charles I who are mad that he's dead and they want to put his son back on the throne. And then we've got the Levelers, who are also Republicans, but they're even more radical Republicans. And they want sort of greater democracy. They want rights for women. They want rights for the poor. They want everyone to be able to vote. So Cromwell is surrounded on all sides. And as is often the case, we will see this pattern repeat with a lot of the revolutions and civil wars that we see in this unit. Cromwell is going to give up on those dreams of freedom and republicanism, and he's like, you know what? Heck to it all. I'm going to make a military dictatorship. And he does, and he disbands Parliament, so it is only Cromwell ruling. Again, that happens a lot. So this, by the way, England is now under this period called the Protectorate, and Cromwell calls himself Lord Protector, which, again, he's a dictator. Now, as Lord Protector, Cromwell basically tries to suppress all opposition and dissent, and then he also tries to enforce his Puritan beliefs. So he gets rid of the Anglican Church because he's a Puritan. He suppresses Catholics, as we already mentioned, right? He censors the press so they can't criticize him. And then one of the kind of funny things in retrospect about all of this is, you guys probably found out as you were researching your social history of the Reformation assignment, you found out that Calvinists especially don't like fun. That's what Cromwell does. He bans bear baiting and all those other fun sports they had during Elizabethan England. He bans gambling. He bans theaters, and he bans swearing. I'm like, how are you going to enforce that, bro? I don't understand. Whatever. You do you, Cromwell. You try. That's what it means when you're a dictator, I guess. All right. Now, it doesn't really last long. Cromwell dies. He does have a son, and he tries to get his son on the throne it's not really a throne here. He tries to pass power onto his son. That doesn't work. And eventually the military is just like, I'm tired of this. This is ridiculous. This is way too much conflict. We're just going to bring the monarchy back. We're going to restore the monarchy. By the way, this is also a pattern in revolutions that we're going to see. We'll see like a dictator come to power. And then a lot of times people are just so fed up at the end of all this. They're like, hey, things seem kind of stable under the monarchy. Why don't we just put the monarchy back? This happens during like the French Revolution, for example, and it doesn't really go that great sometimes. All right, so Charles I's son, Charles II, is restored to the throne. And it might seem like, okay, wait, we just kind of ended up back where we started. We've got, political conflicts, religious conflicts haven't been resolved. But Charles II, he knows that his dad got beheaded, right? So he's highly motivated to cooperate with Parliament, and he accepts their increased power. But the religious conflict comes back, and that's going to cause a huge mess. So what Parliament does when they come back to power is they restore the Anglican Church, and they try and get revenge on the Puritans, And they try and persecute the Catholics for whatever reason, because Anglicans, I guess. And they passed something that is called the Test Act, which ensures that only Anglicans can hold political office. So essentially what they do is they say only Anglicans can have political power in this new society. And Charles II is not happy about this, because he starts out as an Anglican. He actually ends up kind of secretly converting to Catholicism. And he's like, no, Parliament, I don't like this. And he makes an agreement, and basically he becomes friends with King Louis XIV, who is, as you know, in charge of Catholic France. Parliament not happy about this. All right. Now, having a secret Catholic is bad enough, but then England gets a legit Catholic. So religious conflict is going to intensify when Charles II's brother succeeds him, and he is James II. And James II, not happy about the Test Act, he appoints Catholics to high positions in defiance of the Test Act. And not only that, his wife gives birth to a Catholic son, and Parliament sees what's going on here, and they're like, you know what? We got to nip this Catholic thing in the bud. We've got to get rid of this permanently Catholic monarchy. We got to bring Protestants back somehow. How are we going to do that? And what they do is they just go to some Protestants and invite them to take charge. So what they do is James II's son-in-law, William of Orange, is actually, so not his biological son, right? Son-in-law. James's daughter is Mary, and Mary is married to William. Parliament goes to these folks, and he goes, hey, so these folks are over in the Netherlands, and they say, hey, do you guys want to rule England? And they're like, sure, why not? It sounds great. And they actually just come over and take the throne of England, and it's actually the transfer of power is peaceful, mostly. There's not a lot of bloodshed. And so we call this stage the Glorious Revolution. Glorious because England is at the end of this long marathon of people killing each other over religion and politics. And that settles it with relatively little bloodshed. Now we have a new monarchy, and they're Protestants. Now, how are we going to solve all the conflicts, though? Well, first of all, let's talk about how they settle the political conflict. So how do they settle that whole king versus parliament issue? Well, Parliament issues something called the Revel. They actually agree on it together. Parliament and the king agree on something called the Revolution Settlement, which affirms William as king as long as he accepts that Parliament is the boss of him. And when we say Parliament is the boss of him, this means that Parliament can pass something called a Bill of Rights. Oh, hey, gee, do we have one of those in the United States? May that have been inspired by this? Perhaps. I don't know. And what the Bill of Rights does is it says, yeah, Parliament's the boss. He has to cooperate with Parliament if he expects to get anything done. So that's the political conflict settled. Woohoo! Took forever. Now let's talk about the religious conflict. And this is settled by something called the Toleration Act. So what this does is it grants freedom of, so for William and Mary, Anglicans, what this Toleration Act does is it grants freedom of worship to Puritans, although it doesn't actually grant anything to Catholics. So Catholics still kind of on the down and out here. Now, again, this is kind of like a lot of the other sort of religious toleration acts we've seen passed in the last unit and this unit, because it doesn't really grant total religious equality. Because again, Catholics, Puritans, Catholics can't really, you don't even have freedom of worship. Puritans still can't hold high offices. So, kind of settled it. It settles it for now, right? There's not really a lot of conflict after this. So that's that. Thanks for watching.